So in this video, I want to talk about the relationship between Protestantism and the ways that Western civilization changed around the time of the Industrial Revolution and the Enlightenment and that sort of thing. I think most people know this, but I'll say it in case anyone doesn't, that I'm not a Christian, and so I've made some videos about religion this week, but I don't have any bias in terms of which Christian sect is more theologically correct than the other or anything like that. So anyway, with Protestantism, the biggest effect probably, I think, has to do with education, because Protestantism comes in and it says that everyone has to read the Bible, understand the Bible, interpret the Bible for themselves and this sort of thing, and this necessitates a degree of mass education. Now, Catholic nations eventually, of course, do come around to educating their public, but significantly this is in response to competitive pressures placed on them by Protestant nations. And you look at something like the printing press, for instance, and the fact is that the printing press was sitting around in Catholic countries before it was in the Protestant nations, and they didn't have any interest in using it for the purpose of mass literacy and that sort of thing. And this is borne out statistically, so in the 19th century you can take Prussia and break it down into lots of little regions, and the ones with more Protestants had higher levels of literacy, and this remains true after you control for a bunch of stuff about the local economy, the number of schools in the area, and that sort of thing. The same finding is basically found in 19th century Switzerland as well, although there's a little bit of a difference in that this seems to only be true of areas of Switzerland where the government was quite conservative, and that itself has something to do with Catholicism, right? And so that could be interpreted as saying that Protestantism helped people get educated, but it didn't really matter if you lived in a quite liberal place anyhow, maybe quite liberal because it was full of Protestants, and therefore institutionally Protestantism exerted an effect on you if you are Protestant or not. In any case, just more generally across Europe during this time period, you look at the analyses, and book consumption is correlated with Protestantism in Europe in past centuries. And today, Protestantism, firstly, it's associated with national IQ at about 0.23. It's associated with how smart the 95th percentile of people are in a nation at 0.36, adult education levels at 0.48, and the prevalence of books in homes at 0.62. And in most parts of the world, Protestants are more educated than Catholics are. That's true in Protestant Europe, Catholic Europe, the Anglo world, and Africa. Although it's not true everywhere, it's not true in East Asia and Latin America. Continuing with this education stuff, we can also look at this meta-analysis finding that students in Protestant private schools score higher on standardized tests than do students in non-Protestant private schools, whether those are Catholic or not. And talking about what happens when religions are spread, we can look at this 2010 analysis of African nations, and it finds that within Africa, African countries tend to be more educated the more Protestants were there historically. That is not true of Catholics, though. The historic Catholicism in an African nation is no relation to its overall current level of education. And you see the same thing in a global analysis, not just looking at African nations, but nations in general, that Protestantism in 1900 significantly correlates with modern levels of education, but this is not true of Catholicism, suggesting the two religions had different effects in the places they spread with respect to education. Now, I already said that Protestantism correlates with national IQ. It also correlates with IQ within nations. So in America, you can see here that, and maybe it's not obvious immediately looking at this chart, but if you do the numbers overall, Protestants have higher IQs than do Catholics. That's also worth noting just in passing because it's somewhat interesting. Anglicans have really high IQs, higher in fact than our Jewish friends. And you can also see this in Switzerland. This is a medical test or a test for medical school, about 0.2 standard deviation gap favoring Protestants, and you see the same thing in the Netherlands on an IQ test. And so just everywhere you look, it sure looks like Protestantism is making countries more educated and smarter. And this is important for lots of reasons. For one thing, this increases economic growth. Education itself increases economic growth seemingly, so longitudinally you increase education, this precedes an increase in economic growth, and the same is true of increases in IQ, and meta-analyses even today indicate that formal education can increase IQ, and I imagine that was even more true back in the day when people were starting with virtually no formal education. And maybe even more importantly than that, education is an important cause of demographic transitions. So there's this problem that plagues all of the world for almost all of history, where when people get richer, when there are more resources in the economy to spread around, they just have more kids. And so, if you double over a certain number of generations, you double the amount of national wealth, but you also double the number of people, then wealth per person has not moved at all. Now, if you make everyone get really formally educated, though, and through the educational mechanisms that developed in the European and Protestant world in the modern era, then what happens, of course, is that they are dedicating their time and resources to education and self-development in some sense during their fertile periods, and so this allows you to have an increase in wealth and falling fertility at the same time. And indeed, statistical analyses show that this event, which is sometimes called the first demographic transition, that this was significantly caused by increases in schooling, and that the effect of education on declining fertility in Europe during this period was stronger than the direct effects of income. So it's not just that everyone is rich and so you have money and so you just don't have kids. It really is this effect of income that is driving that. And that's just a very important cause of the modern levels of wealth that we see. It is not a coincidence, it's not the whole story, but it's not a coincidence that we got way richer per person at the same time that our fertility rates started falling like a rock. And of course, you can make arguments that maybe that isn't as good as it sounds initially, and how do we want to really evaluate that, and that's not the topic of this video. So, moving from education to economic growth, Protestantism today correlates at about 0.3 with national wealth, but levels of Protestantism do not correlate with economic growth. Right, so more Protestant countries are richer, but they're not growing faster. But growth in Protestantism does predict economic growth. So, and that's true even if you control for initial wealth in a country. And that sure seems like Protestantism is driving economic growth, but it's the kind of relationship where if you want Protestantism to make you richer, then you have to increase the level of Protestantism. And that's what the modern picture looks like. Now, back in the 19th century, the 19th century is a little bit complicated because of researchers who say things that I don't like. So, there are these two papers that are often cited in the literature showing that Protestantism does not cause increases in economic growth. And here's the data from one of them, and what it shows is moderate to large positive correlations between Protestantism and the wealth in a country, the level of bank deposits, the level of savings, even controlling for wealth, the frequency of stock exchanges, etc. in the 19th century. And so you might say, well, that sure seems like evidence in favor of the theory that Protestantism causes economic growth, and you would be right. This is exactly what we would predict based on that hypothesis. The problem is these findings are not statistically significant, and the reason why they're not statistically significant is because these analyses have samples of like 13. Sample size of 13 is going to mean that you have to have a huge effect in order for it to be statistically significant. So what are we to make of that? Well, firstly, if we just set aside statistical significance for a second and just remember how probabilistic reasoning works, these findings of moderate to large positive effects of Protestantism on economic growth are exactly what you would predict if Protestantism had a moderate to large positive impact on economic growth. And so, since the finding is what the model would predict, obviously it increases the posterior probability of the model. This finding is more likely on that hypothesis than the hypothesis that Protestantism has no effect on economic growth. Clearly it's evidence in its favor. This is cited as evidence against that hypothesis that Protestantism causes economic growth in the academic literature, and that is because academics are very silly people. Now, more fundamentally, I think that this is just a misunderstanding of significance testing to even talk about significance in this sort of context, because statistical significance refers to the probability that you'd find a sample in which there's some association between two variables when the sample is a sample plucked from a population which is infinitely larger, and in which, so in that population, there's actually no association between the two variables in question. It's a measure of the probability that your result is due to sampling error. And this makes no sense here because the sample, quote-unquote, we're looking at is just the set of European nations. It is not a sample which is taken from an infinitely larger Europe, right? This is just not a thing. It's not like we took a bunch of college kids or a bunch of random Americans, 200 random Americans, and we're wondering how likely is it that this is also true of the 300 million American population. In this case, we're looking at Europe. We're worried about Europe. We're concerned with Europe. There is no sampling error that is possible because we're just analyzing the relationship in the countries that we have data on. These countries, firstly, you might say, well, maybe these countries are a sample of the global set of nations, and that's not true because if you wanted, well, firstly, it's not a representative sample, right? This is not random, it's specifically Europe. And then secondly, if you were going to do it like that, there's a way you adjust the statistical significance involving changing the standard error in the calculation, and this is not done in these papers. That is not what is going on. And then it's also important to realize that this is not the same as saying that we can't come to generalizable causal conclusions here about causal relations. That's different than talking about the fact that you can't generalize something because it might be due to sampling error. These two things are distinct. This finding does support the generalizable claim that Protestantism causes economic growth, and all of this statistical confusion, I think, is just the result of researchers using heuristics in an unthinking way. So anyway, the second paper, which does the same thing, basically shows that Protestantism correlated with economic growth in the period of 1500 to 1870. The exact size of the correlation depends on which time period you pick. You can see here the scatter plot for the longest time span for which this correlation was calculated. The correlation is above zero, but far from perfect. But it's also worth mentioning that they are not measuring growth in Protestantism. Now, we saw in the modern world that Protestantism is not a correlate of economic growth at all, but growth in Protestantism is. So what you would want to do is, in the historical analysis, to also look at both current levels of Protestantism and growth in Protestantism, but that is not done here. And so the fact that we're seeing a positive correlation even without looking at growth in Protestantism, just at a measure of a constant level of Protestantism, I think offers fairly good support for the view that Protestantism is a cause of economic growth. And that is what I think clearly all of this data taken together indicates. And so we can ask why. And one reason we might suppose is that this is all just down to education, because I've already said that Protestantism increases education and education increases economic growth. And there's some reason to think that's true. There's analyses of Prussia and Germany where they show, obviously Prussia being in the 19th century, Germany being today, and they show that you break these countries down into little regions. The ones that are more Protestant are more economically developed, but that is not true once you control for education, suggesting that Protestants' effect on economic growth is just something mediated by formal education. But on the other hand, very famously, there's all this talk about the Protestant work ethic, the idea that Protestantism theologically incentivizes people to work harder. And there's some support for that too. I mean, for instance, Protestantism predicts labor participation rates, even after you control for government policy and economic growth and wealth per person and all this sort of thing. And in fact, Protestants react psychologically to unemployment more negatively than non-Protestants do. So I'm not saying that the Protestant work ethic isn't a thing at all. Maybe it is, maybe it's a contributing factor as well, but I don't think the evidence for the Protestant work ethic is as strong as is the evidence for Protestantism having an effect via education. In any case, these are not mutually exclusive hypotheses. So moving on from education and growth in the economy to democracy, here again I think we see a pretty strong relationship, and this is to be expected for a lot of reasons, right? You can create tons of stories about why Protestants would be more likely to support democracy. You could say that democracy at the time was a revolt against pre-existing power structures in Europe, and these were largely Catholic power structures, that Protestantism is kind of naturally elevating the individual and is predisposed against at least centralized authority of certain kinds. Or you might talk about how Protestants sort of saw themselves as a persecuted religious minority in Europe, and this plausibly gives them an incentive to support government structures that are thought to protect minority rights. All sorts of stories you could tell, and then you look at the history of Western Europe, and at the intellectual level, some of the first really important supporters of republicanism and government checks and balances and all this sort of thing, or people like John Calvin. Republicanism itself sort of comes out of the Protestant world, and especially the Anglo world. In the Protestant world, you have political revolutions that take countries of already relatively liberal governments and make them even more liberal and more democratic. The obvious example being America. In the Catholic world, you have countries that start with very non-democratic governments, and then they have political revolutions, and then everything just goes to hell. An example of this obviously is France. Now eventually, of course, Catholic nations come around to support democracy and have democracies, but there's some complications here. I mean, for one thing, oftentimes democracies in Catholic nations are very short-lived, so see like the entire history of Latin America, for example. Oftentimes democracies are enforced on Catholic nations by Protestant nations. This happened in the World Wars, this happened in the Cold War, and even when not forced, Catholic nations transitioning to democracy do so in a context of global hegemony of Protestant nations. So you look at Spain doing this, for example. Many people would argue that Spain's transition into democracy would have been a lot less likely had it not been for the dominance of democracy having already been established in much of Western Europe at that time. And then you look at what happens when Protestant nations go undemocratic. You look at something like Nazi Germany, and it's notable that it's not done by Protestants, right? I'm not saying that Nazi Germany was a particularly Catholic thing either. I think Catholics were less likely than average to support the Nazis, but the Nazi movement also very obviously was not Protestant, and in fact, I think Hitler, on paper at least, was a Catholic. And so that's the history of Europe, and it's kind of hard to do a statistical analysis of Europe today because there's no variation, because everywhere is a democracy. But since the 1970s, an awful lot of non-Western nations have made an attempt at democracy, and it's noteworthy that the vast majority of these have just literally failed. And there's research looking at why that is, and what it finds is that the historical prevalence of Protestantism in a nation today correlates with higher levels of democracy. By contrast, once again, the historical prevalence of Catholicism in a country, well, this just has no effect on how democratic it ends up being. And it's also worth noting that this relationship between Protestantism and democracy, it persists after controlling for whether or not a place is an ex-British colony, the proportion of the country that is white, whether or not it is an ex-Dutch colony, etc. So this is not explicable merely in terms of race or something like that. And in fact, more broadly, you look at global analyses of just the total set of nations, and once again, Protestantism is found correlated with modern levels of democracy, and this is true even after controlling for whether or not a place was sort of somewhere where democracy flourished very early, its degree of European ancestry, its wealth, etc. So it's a pretty robust effect. And you look at analyses of governments in transition, and what you find is that they're more likely to set up stable, long-lasting democracies the more Protestant they are, and that Protestant nations have more in the way of so-called civil society, all these voluntary associations that are prevalent in non-kin-based, democratic, individualistic society. So now, moving from democracy to science, firstly, there are some sort of theological reasons having to do with an anti-authoritarian bent for which we might suspect Protestantism would be associated with scientific achievement. And in the second place, if you look at regressions showing where high levels of scientific innovation tend to happen, what they say is that they tend to happen in wealthy nations with high levels of intelligence and non-authoritarian governments. And as I've already argued, Protestantism tends to set up exactly those contexts. And thirdly, Protestants are just overrepresented in science. So you look at it, and Protestants are overrepresented in Nobel Prize winners, and this is true both in America and globally. And if you look at in Europe, the geographic distribution of scientific innovation, what you see is that in the 1600 to 1800 period, the period after the emergence of Protestantism, science innovation is very concentrated in Protestant Europe. But by contrast, in the period of 1400 to 1600, most of which is before the rise of Protestantism, scientific innovation is concentrated in Southern Europe. And so this is what you would expect, perhaps, if Protestantism had some kind of causal effect on scientific achievement. The other religious group it's worth mentioning that is super associated with science and the like is obviously Jews. And as I've already said, I think this kind of fits into the model that I'm proposing here, because Jewish people also have this history of mass education. That's not the only reason why Jews are overrepresented in science, nor is this the only reason why Northwestern Europeans are overrepresented in science, but the fact that they both have that lends credence to the idea that it's a contributing factor. So, to conclude, firstly I should say, just to reiterate, I am not claiming that Protestantism is the only cause of any of these things. It's obviously not, but it does have some impressive theoretical virtues, at least given the low bar that has been set by the things that are normally said about this sort of stuff. For one thing, it's temporally concordant with the events we're trying to explain. That's a very low bar, but people often talk about this. You listen to someone like a Ben Shapiro type, and he says, all this stuff happened because of, he's just the height of insanity. He doesn't even say Christian values. He says Judeo-Christian values, as if Judaism somehow caused this, which is just totally insane, right? It's kind of like a joke of a view. But even the Christian thing, it's like, firstly, Christianity has been around for a long time, and so is Greek logic and all this sort of thing. It's been around for about 2,000 years prior to any of this stuff happening. And Christianity, and knowing what logic is spread all over Europe, so it doesn't explain when it happened or where it happened. This idea that it's just Christian values, let alone Jewish values. And so at the very least it has that going for it. Now obviously, the centuries-long development of individualism and intelligence via cultural and biological selection in Northwestern Europe is super important in explaining any of this stuff. And these things all play off each other. Intelligent individualist people are likely to set up liberal governments. Societies that have liberal governments and are intelligent and individualistic are ones in which Protestantism will naturally flourish. And so, it's like this virtuous cycle of influences that leads to this explosion of development in Northwestern Europe. At least a virtuous cycle to the degree that you think that sort of the increase in democracy and education and all this sort of thing was good. People have varied opinions about that. I don't think anyone really is mad about the economic growth or the science, but the education and the democracy is more contentious. And again, it's not the point of this video to sort of adjudicate whether or not all of these things are good or bad. It's just to sort of document the fact that Protestantism is pretty essential in understanding how Europe ended up the way it is today. Now, there's one element of that sort of contention that I have not addressed in this video, and that has to do with progressivism and liberalism. I said in my last video, the whole video was about documenting. Catholics are quite leftist today. They didn't used to be. Protestantism used to be associated with progressivism. Classical liberalism also was partly a Protestant thing, pretty significantly, I would say. And in this video, I've talked about advocacy for democracy, but not about specific, social views, social movements, economic movements, and that's purposeful. I'm not going to do that here. I might make a different video about that someday, but that's not this video. That's just too complicated of a subject to tack onto this video. It would require just its own video, how the different sects of Christianity came over time to associate with political ideology in different ways. Anyway, that's the video. If you liked it, consider giving it a like or a comment or sharing it on social media. And if you like the channel, consider supporting it via one of the links in the description. And in any case, thanks for watching.